until you put the wrong things right.
Running out of time to save her. I'm gonna kill them. Every single one of them.
How many people have you loved?
I'll never be alone.
The Crow is directed by Rupert Sanders and is of course a remake of the 1994 classic comic book adaptation of the same name, The Crow, that starred Brandon Lee. This film stars Bill Skarsgård in the main role of Eric Draven, aka The Crow. It stars FKA Twigs as the love interest Shelley in this film, and it stars Danny Houston, that I knew from Yellowstone, as basically the asshole trying to take the Yellowstone Ranch. Why would you do that? Why would you poke the bear? And in this movie, he's back poking the bear, but this time he plays Vincent, a supernatural presence that is basically trying to steal the souls of innocent people. But I'm actually going to give you a deeper dive into the synopsis of this film because I feel like they did something unique and different with this remake, and I appreciated that, and I wanted to touch on that. Now, what I mean by all that is that typically when Hollywood does a remake of a classic film that people love, they'll get updated actors for the positions of that movie, but they'll basically copy-paste the story. And instead of making it about an apartment building that was being cleared out by thugs one day, and they killed Shelley and they killed Eric Draven, and then Eric Draven had to come back as the Crow and brutally murder all of them. In this film, they go a different route, and I really appreciate the movie for doing that because you can sit down and watch this film and you don't feel like you're just watching a copy paste of that original 94 film. With that said, this movie does have to go down that route where Shelley is going to be taken from Eric Draven, but how do they get there? I'll give you the setup. Essentially, in this movie, you have Eric Draven, played by Bill Skarsgård, who did not have a very good childhood, and it basically brought him down a path where he kept getting into trouble, and now he is in some sort of a detention center drug rehab. And at the same time, FKA Twigs' character of Shelley has found out some really nasty information about the main villain in this film, Vincent. And just as Vincent's men at the beginning of this movie are going to take her out for knowing too much, she stumbles into police officers, accidentally drops drugs out of her purse, and she now gets taken to that same detention center / rehab and is in the same place as Eric Draven. And that is where they meet. And right off the bat, I want to say that I appreciate the difference in story in this film because, hey, if you still want a movie where you don't have much backstory on the love relationship of Eric Draven and his love interest in that film, and you want that, well, you can go back to that 94 film and watch it. But if you want to watch a film where you actually find out why they fell in love, why their love is so real, why their love is so deep, well, The Crow gives that to you in the setup for this film. One thing leads to another in this detention center, and they end up meeting each other, falling in love with each other, and escaping. And the movie then takes its time showing you this relationship that Eric Draven and Shelley have. But eventually, Vincent's men do catch up with her in this film, and they not only kill Shelley in front of Eric Draven, but then kill Eric Draven. Eric Draven then, that is where the story sort of merges with the 94 film, because at that point, he then comes back as the Crow, led by crows, given this supernatural crow ability.
I drink it every morning so I can fight like a crow.
To come back and be vengeance towards all of these people, all of these supernatural beings that are taking the souls of innocent victims. Okay, that is the biggest setup I can give you, and I'm sorry for the extra long setup if you didn't want to hear all that. Maybe you've seen the movie and you're like, Mike, I know already, and I apologize for that. But I just wanted to set that up because, again, I feel like the setup is very different in this film versus the 94 movie, and I wanted to talk about it, and this is my video. So with all that said, that's the best setup I can give you for this movie. If that sounds interesting to you and you haven't seen it yet, well, you could go check this movie out. It is playing in theaters, and I believe it's going to come to streaming very soon because it's not doing very well in theaters. Well, let's jump into my positives and some of my negatives. The first positive I have for this movie is going to be that I liked the supernatural element that they used in this film. I feel like they used the supernatural film way more than that original movie. And while I feel like this movie tries to stand on its own, it's hard not to try and compare it to that original movie. A lot of people loved it. I'm not really in that love camp for that movie. I understand people's love for that movie, especially if you got to see it when it originally came out in theaters, had that awesome soundtrack with it. And so you watch that movie and now you're looking at this movie like, all right, how are we going to compare? So I'm not trying to compare the entire time. time, but if we are going to compare, I do like that supernatural element that this movie had over that original film. To me, it gave the Crow a little bit more reason to come back as this supernatural being who's going after all of these bad guys with vengeance, and ultimately all of these guys he's going after are mortal, except for the main villain, Vincent, who has supernatural abilities because of a deal he made with the devil. And I've heard people complain that this movie takes its time getting there, but I feel like all of that's important because of the setup I already talked about in this video. I feel like the movie needed to do that. I feel like it needed to give you that backstory. I felt like it needed to show you that relationship build and grow, and you needed to be invested in it as a viewer. And I don't know everybody else's personal experience with this movie, but for me, all of that worked. I loved the supernatural tie-in to this film because it gave credibility for the reason to need the Crow to come back and strike vengeance all over the place. And speaking of that action, let's talk about that brutal, violent action that you get in this film. Now, I will say that I have a negative later that we'll talk about that has to do with some of the action scenes in this movie, but if we're going off of just the pure action that you got to see, there's a few moments where he has a sword and he is killing people left and right, and it's pretty awesome to watch. I love the one moment where he's in an apartment and he has his sword up against the guy's mouth and he just runs that blade into him, and you see the guy's whole half a face crack open. If you've seen the scene, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, that's worth the movie, in my opinion. I loved the violence in this film. I don't feel like it held back at all. The opera house scene where it's just constantly action scene, all the way up until he finds the woman that he's trying to find at the time. I found all of that highly entertaining. If you want brutal, bloody violence, this movie has it. My next positive is the soundtrack for this film. Much like the 94 film, they put some effort into the soundtrack for this movie. Most notably, there's a song that I heard during this movie that I was like, oh, I need to know what this is. And I looked it up afterwards, and it's called Total Depravity by The Veils. Maybe all of you know about it, maybe you don't know about it, but that song not only worked for me in the movie, but it's a song I've listened to every day since I've seen that movie. That song really works for me. I loved it. I've never heard of The Veils before. I've never heard of Total Depravity before, but now I've listened to it every day since I watched this movie last week, and I'll be listening to it for a while more. So for the soundtrack of this movie, just giving me a song, I think it's the first movie this year that's given me a song that I added to my Apple playlist, and that's a big deal to me. So again, I think they did put some effort into the soundtrack for this movie, and I really like that Total Depravity by The Veils. And so I will say that if you haven't seen the movie, still go check out that song for me. And my final positive, something I've sort of touched on throughout all of these positives, and that is that this movie genuinely tries to be its own thing. Yes, they are using Eric Draven, the Crow, the whole idea of the Crows bringing him back, and they do it a little differently, but they do so much of the plot differently in this film. I feel like the movie really tries to be its own thing. And I can't be more appreciative of that as someone who watches remakes all the time, because that's typically what's churned out. It's either sequels, prequels, remakes. It's very rare that we get something brand new, and I appreciate the brand new stuff, but when you get a remake of a movie but they change some plot elements and those plot elements work for me, I have nothing but kind things to say about it. So I appreciate that this movie really tries to go its own direction. But those are the end of the positives. Let's get into the negatives. And my first negative for this film does revolve around the character of Vincent. And while I did praise this movie for making him more supernatural, giving the Crow a real supernatural villain to have to go after, which I appreciated, I did find Danny Houston's portrayal of Vincent kind of boring. Like, the scenes with him were a bit boring, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the pacing of this movie in a second, but that was something I wish we had gotten a little bit more out of. Danny Houston's character, Vincent, is supposed to be this character that's lived for centuries because he made a deal with the devil where he'd send him innocent souls and he'd get to live forever, and I wish they had picked someone a little younger, maybe that could have gone back and forth with the Crow a little bit, because that was really missing from this film. I mean, the entire movie, Eric Draven is making his way toward Vincent for his ultimate vengeance. He's taking out all of his henchmen, he's taking out all of his commanders while he's going through his bloody crusade of vengeance. And when you finally get there, you're like, all right, here we go. Because in the original 94 film, and here we are comparing again, but he gets to that final bad guy and then he has that final confrontation and they have an actual fight. In this movie, it's more of a fight of words. And that was a bit of a disappointment because you get to this final boss scene. You're like, all right, now it's Supernatural Vincent versus Supernatural the Crow. What are they going to do? They're going to talk a lot and stab each other a lot and bring each other into the Crow world and talk. Really? That's what you're going to do? And that was a bit disappointing. So I do feel like while there was a good bit of action in this film, when you get to that final scene, if they had cast a younger actor, maybe they could have had a few awesome fight scenes. And honestly, you don't even have to cast a younger actor anymore with what you can do with CGI. But even still, it's just like, why did you build this huge supernatural thing, and then when you get to that moment, it's like Vincent going, I don't know, let's talk. Can we talk for a little bit? That was a bit annoying. My next negative of this movie is that sometimes the writing and the logic of this film is a bit off. Like, okay, for instance, in the detention center, they never really allude to why all of the guards absolutely hate Eric Draven, but they do. To the point where, like, as he's walking out of the shower room back to his cell, you'll have a guard just whip that towel away from him. And I'm like, what was the logic in that? Was there another side story to this at one point where the guards had a reason to really dislike him? Because they never really go into why they're like that, and they never explain why they treat him specifically like that, because there's all other kinds of prisoners walking around and they're not doing anything to them. But to him, oh, they have no problem messing with him. And so while they're doing that, you're just kind of like, okay, I wonder if this is going to lead to him getting his supernatural crow powers and somehow having to fight all of those prison guards. And you're like, all right, this might be fun. They're going to get theirs. And then they don't. And you're just like, oh, well, then they were just being dicks to him. For what reason? Maybe to make you have more sympathy for him. Like, oh man, this poor guy just can't catch a break. But honestly, like, we're eventually going to sympathize with him anyway. So there were some weird writing issues there, or just like whatever they had decided to go with in that prison that didn't make a lot of sense to me. There were also dumb bad guys in this movie, and that was another issue I had with it. So it was more along the writing of how they wrote the characters, and more along those logic writing issues. You get into this movie where they have this showdown at an opera house, and one of this commanders who was directly responsible for killing Shelley and Eric Draven, she's upstairs at this opera house, and as he's walking in, those bad guys are filling him with like 50 bullets at a time, and he's just eating them, and then he's going up to them and taking them out, and she knows this is how it's going down. At one point, she even calls Vincent like, hey, he's taking out all of our men. And Vincent's not worried about it because he's got supernatural devil powers, but she doesn't have any of that. And instead of trying to make a break for it, trying to get out of there, she just waits. And you're just like, well, what's the logic there? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so there were some plot issues I had with this film, some logic issues, and even some writing issues, the way they talk to each other in those scenes. It was just like, really, you're not going to do anything? You're just going to stand there like, oh yeah, you've got a bodyguard, great. Because he just took out 25 of them on the way up here. But all right, yeah, your bodyguard will work. Oh, there's his head. So it's like, why did you do that? There were some logic issues. And my final negative of this film is going to be that the pacing throughout the action scene was a bit jarring. So the movie takes a good portion of the film sort of building up to your expectation of what this crow is going to be and why he needs to have all this vengeance. And then once he gets the powers, he's not just automatically on a vengeance tour like the 94 movie. He has to understand those powers, how they work, and sort of build his way up. The first couple of fights he gets in, he gets killed several times more, goes back to this crow underworld, gets sent back a couple times. So they really take their time getting there. And when they finally are like, all right, now he's got it together, let's go for it. He's going through these action scenes and they're cutting away to Vincent, or they're cutting away to one of the commanders, or they're cutting away to Shelley sort of watching from the underworld. And you're just like, hey, I'd like to watch this action scene at one time if possible. Now, I understand completely that action movies do this a lot and say, hey, they got to cut over to this action scene over here. They got to cut away to the bad guys getting away over here. I understand that. But this movie had so much of it, and there was so much of that could have just been taken out, and you could have just enjoyed him killing people for like 15, 20 minutes. Had they done that, have they taken like 15 minutes to just show him go on a murder spree, then maybe when they got to the end with Vincent and Vincent wants to talk, it would be like, all right, my mind just exploded watching all of those things happen, so I'm good with this. But instead, this kind of leads to my issue with Vincent wanting a big talk at the end of this film, because they kept cutting away from the action scenes, and while the action itself was cool, they kept cutting away from it to do exposition dumping so that you'd learn even more. And that annoyed me. Overall, I didn't hate this movie. I went into this movie with very low expectations, and maybe that's what I need to do with more movies. I did not hate this movie. I don't think it is the worst Crow movie that's ever been made. I know people are like, this is the worst movie of the year, and that's fair. Maybe those people think that, and they are allowed to, because all movies are subjective, but I didn't find this as the worst movie. I thought it gave motivation to Eric Draven. I thought it gave motivation to him becoming the Crow, needing to seek that vengeance. They gave Vincent a good enough story where he had supernatural abilities and he could make it to the very end of this movie. So I think there's a good story in here. The execution, not as good as I wish they would have done, especially with those action scenes. Would I recommend that you guys go check this out? Well, this is coming out a little bit later than the movie actually released. So for those of you who haven't checked it out yet, I don't know if you're planning to, I would say wait for it on streaming. I think this is a movie that you could maybe enjoy a little bit more at your house if you had the ability to pause it and walk away like, all right, that's a lot of exposition. I'll be right back. I don't know how you watch movies at your house. Sometimes that's how I watch movies here. I'm in the middle of watching the Watchmen Chapter 1 animated movie for like the last couple of days because I'm like, there's nothing new to this plot. So I completely understand that everybody watches movies a little bit differently. I don't think this is one you gotta rush to the theater to watch. I think you'll have the same experience at home or on a plane if you decide to watch it there. Some of you will. But those are just my opinions because that's my review for The Crow. Guys, if you had a chance to see this movie yet, if you have, let me know in the comment section down below. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with me. Maybe you think all of my positives were actually negatives and you hated this film and it's the worst movie of the year. And if that's what you think, that's okay. But maybe like me, you went in with low expectations and you're like, you know what? There was some good out of this movie. It's not the worst movie I've seen this year, but it's not the best movie I've seen this year anyway. I'm not even claiming this is in my top 20 for the entire year. It's probably in the bottom 20, but I don't think it's in the bottom 10. I don't think it's that bad of a film. But if you like this video and you want to watch more, don't forget to hit that like button because it helps the video, it helps the channel, and it helps me right here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Alright guys, we got to the end of my The Crow review, and honestly I had a great time making this review because there was enough in this film for me to actually get excited to tell you guys about it, good and bad. I felt like this movie was a mixed bag. Not my favorite movie of the year by far, but hey, I had a good time with it. Hey, if this is the first time you found my channel and this is the first video you're watching, thank you for watching this long. I appreciate that. I would love for you guys to subscribe and check out all the different content I have. I've got a ton of Blu-ray reviews, movie reviews. I've got Blu-ray Talk where we talk about all those Blu-rays on my shelves back there. And finally, if you like this video and you want to check out other content on my channel, well, I've got all of my 2024 best and worst right there. And I've got all of my 2024 movie reviews right there.